I sit in my wheelchair, a wool blanket, a gift from my granddaughter, draped over my knees. The air in Portland always carries a hint of damp pine, but for the past few days, the smell has been different. The wind blowing off the river brings with it a scent that is acrid yet makes my soul tremble. The smell of spent high-octane aviation fuel mixed with hot oil and heated mahogany. Down at the docks on the Willamette River, a group of white-haired old guys are bustling around a green monster. That is, PT-658. When those three Packard 4 M2500 V12 engines roar to life simultaneously, the surrounding yachts and modern fishing boats seem pale and feeble by comparison. That sound is like a beast waking from the abyss, low, temperamental, with every piston stroke hammering against my eardrums. To the young people today, it's just noise, an antique from a museum. But to me, Jack Sullivan, that sound is the heartbeat of the dark nights in the Solomon Islands in 1942. It is the thunder amidst the rainstorms of the Surigao Strait in 1944. People always stare at the big ones, the Enterprise, the Missouri. History books are filled with the dive bombing of carrier-based aircraft and the broadsides of battleships. But they don't know about the narrow channels where the main fleets dared not tread, the dead angles where radar was blind, the pitch-black nights when even the moon was afraid to come out. They don't know that it was us, a bunch of lunatics driving plywood speedboats, who changed the course of the war with blood and gasoline. The story I want to tell is about courage, about fear, and even more so, about the tactical secrets long buried by the Navy Department. It is the story of how we turned a pile of racing boats, originally dismissed as rich men's toys, into devil boats that made the Imperial Japanese Navy tremble. Before my memory rots away completely along with my body, I want to take you back to that burning sea. May 1941, Melville, Rhode Island, Motor Torpedo Boat, Squadron's Training Center. If you walked into a U.S. Navy recruiting station in 1941 and told the tobacco-chewing sergeant that you wanted to drive a torpedo boat, he would probably look at you like you were an alien and then kick you over to the line signing up for battleships or cruisers. Son, the Navy floats on steel, that beefy-faced sergeant once spat at me. You want to play with wooden boats? That's a yacht club for rich kids who flunked out of the Naval Academy. We fight wars here. We don't host regattas. He was right, but he was also completely wrong. The U.S. Navy at the time was like a slow-reacting elephant. Although we had world champion racing boats like Miss America back in the 20s, the Navy brass, those old diehards who worshipped the big gun doctrine, sneered at small boats displacing less than 50 tons. In their eyes, war was battle lines blasting away at each other, the collision of tens of thousands of tons of steel. If General Douglas MacArthur hadn't been screaming like a madman in the Philippines for a fast, mobile defensive force, and if Assistant Secretary of the Navy Charles Edison hadn't insisted we learn from the British, the PT boat program might have died in the womb I was assigned to the Elko Receiving Group. I was there because I'd been an apprentice at the Brooklyn Navy Yard and knew a thing or two about mechanics, and because no regular fleet unit wanted me after I broke an Army sergeant's nose in a bar fight. When I first saw the PT-10, an improvement on the British 70-foot Scott Payne prototype, I have to admit, I fell in love, and I was simultaneously terrified. She was beautiful. The mahogany hull shone red in the sunlight, her streamlined body like a sharp dagger. But when I knocked on the hull and it produced a dull wooden thud, my heart went cold. "Is this plywood?" I asked the grease-stained mechanic next to me. His name was Joey, from the Bronx, and he always had an unlit cigar dangling from his mouth, double-planked mahogany with aviation canvas and glue sandwiched in between. Joey grinned, revealing a gold tooth. "Just this skin. No armor, no torpedo blisters, Sullivan. If the Japs hit us with a 20mm cannon, this boat will shatter like a matchbox." "Then what keeps us alive?" "Speed, my friend. Pure speed." Joey patted the engine cover behind him. 3 Packard V12 engines, 1,200 horsepower each. we can hit over 40 knots. That means, except for airplanes, nothing can catch us. The next few months were training hell. We learned how to tame this beast. It wasn't just driving a boat, it was acrobatics. At high speeds, the bow would pitch up high, and the force of the hull slamming against the water could shatter your spine. We had to learn how to keep our balance in that violent turbulence, how to aim in a firing window that lasted only seconds. But we also discovered those deadly secret flaws, the things the Navy Department didn't want to write in their reports. First were the torpedoes. We were equipped with leftover WWII Mk8s, or the early, unreliable Mk14. These torpedoes were not only slow but prone to malfunction when launched at high speeds. Even worse, to accommodate these heavy iron logs, the later PT-20 models had to lengthen the hull. Second was stealth. Though the boats were small, the noise of 3 Packard engines running at full throttle was like a low-flying bomber. To solve this, we installed mufflers on the exhaust ports, but that compromised our speed. We are driving a coffin filled with high explosives and thousands of gallons of high-octane gasoline. My comrade Huffman, a farm boy from Texas, muttered one night after a failed simulated attack, wiping his gun. One spark, and we're all done for. That is why we are called mosquitoes. Squadron Commander Bulkley walked in, his eyes sharp as a hawk's. A mosquito doesn't crash head-on into a rhino. The mosquito comes out at night, bites where the rhino can't see, injects its venom, and vanishes. Remember, boys, our secret weapon isn't the torpedo. It's fear. We want the Japanese to feel fear in every dark corner. Although we were fired up at the time, none of us expected that real fear would arrive so soon. December 7th, 1941, Oahu, Pearl Harbor. The sunlight that morning was so good, it made you want to cry. Several boats of our Squadron 1 were docked at the pier near the submarine base. It was Sunday, and the air was filled with the smell of coffee and the sweet scent of distant pineapple fields. Joey and I were sitting on the deck of PT-23, holding aluminum mess kits filled with lousy Navy beans and sausages. Say, if we get a pass this weekend, you want to check out that dance hall in Honolulu? Joey was saying, then stopped, his spoon hovering in midair. What's that sound? A dull buzzing came from the distance, like a swarm of angry wasps. Immediately after, a loud explosion tore from the direction of Ford Island. I stood up, squinting at the sky. A plane dove out of the clouds, the red circle on its wings blindingly bright in the sun. A drill? Huffman poked his head out of the hatch. A drill my ass! That's the Japs! I roared, dropping my mess kit, beans spilling all over the deck. Air raid! Air raid! General quarters! The sirens finally ripped through the peace of Pearl Harbor. Then came the hellscape. I watched the battleship Arizona take a bomb. A massive fireball soared into the sky, the shockwave shaking our hull. Black smoke instantly blotted out the sun, turning the blue water black and blood red. Start engines! Move! The squadron commander's order sounded distorted over the loudspeaker, but we couldn't get out. The harbor was chaos, filled with burning debris and sailors in the water. Our boats were too small, insignificant in the face of such destructive power. Look there! 3 o'clock! Joey yelled. A Japanese Type 97 carrier attack bomber, a Kate, had just dropped its torpedo and was skimming low over the water, trying to pull up. The pilot even arrogantly opened his canopy, looking back at his handiwork. In that moment, a primal rage overtook my mind. This wasn't training anymore. This was a slaughter. We were beasts trapped in a cage, but beasts have fangs. Joey and I rushed to the twin-point .50 caliber Browning machine gun turret on the stern. It was designed for surface targets, but right now, who gave a damn? Eat shit, you bastard! Joey cranked the handles madly, elevating the muzzle to the limit, rat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat. The heavy, rhythmic pounding of the machine guns rang out on the deck. tracers lashed out like a red whip, slamming viciously into the Japanese plane I was feeding the ammo. My hands scalded red by the hot belt, but I felt no pain. That plane clearly hadn't expected these unassuming little wooden boats to fight back. It wasn't fast, and it was too low. Our bullets shredded its aluminum skin and punched into the engine. I saw black smoke billow from its nose, and then it lost control, nose-diving into the water behind the subbase with a massive splash. "Got him! Sully, we got him!" Huffman screamed beside me, tears streaming down his face. That morning, all of Pearl Harbor was burning. Battleships sank, airfields were destroyed, but in that corner, on Squadron 1's ground, we bunch of guys driving toy boats shot down 2 enemy planes with machine guns. This might be insignificant in the grand narrative of the war, but it wasn't just a kill. It was a declaration. The PT boat force would not sit and wait to die. Even in the most desperate moments, we would bite a chunk out of the enemy. However, Pearl Harbor was just the appetizer. True hell was waiting for us in the distant Philippines. January, March 1942, the Philippines, Manila Bay to the Mindanao Sea. If Pearl Harbor was a raid, the Battle of the Philippines was a slow death by 1,000 cuts. Stationed in Manila Bay, Squadron 3 was in a state 10 times worse than our brothers at Pearl. We had only 6 old PT-20 boats, PT-31-35 and PT-41. The promised reinforcements, the 6 boats of Squadron 1, were stuck in Pearl Harbor because the war had started. We became orphans. On December 10th, Japanese air raids destroyed the Cavite Navy Yard. We lost our repair base, our spare parts, and even clean fuel became a luxury. We lived like nomads, hiding in the shadows of mangroves, camouflaging the hulls with branches during the day to avoid Japanese planes, and coming out at night to execute suicidal missions. Our tasks became bizarre: reconnaissance, running supplies to the besieged Corregidor Island, and even trying to ambush the Japanese fleet with those few unreliable torpedoes. I remember one night in January, Captain Schumacher of PT-32 swore he hit a Japanese cruiser. We heard the cheers over the radio, but intelligence later showed that the so-called cruiser was just the mine layer Yayama, and even if the torpedo hit, it didn't explode. The Japanese thought it was shore artillery missing the mark. That sense of powerlessness gnawed at our hearts like a viper. Our boats began to rot in the tropical humidity, barnacles encrusted the hulls, and the engines wheezed from bad fuel. By March, the situation on the Bataan Peninsula was irretrievable. The Japanese iron pincers were closing. Just then, we received that famous order: escort General MacArthur through the blockade. It was a crazy plan. Put the Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific in a wooden boat that could fall apart at any moment, with no armor protection, and cross hundreds of miles of sea blockaded by the Japanese. It was practically betting the fate of America on a rotten gambling table. At dusk on March 11th, Lieutenant Bulkeley commanded PT-41, carrying MacArthur, his family, and staff out of Corregidor. Huffman and I were on PT-34 flying escort. It was a night I will never forget for the rest of my life. The sea seemed to be against us. The waves were terrifyingly huge. The PT boat leaped on the crests of the waves, and every time we slammed back into the water, I felt like my skeleton was going to shatter. Through my binoculars, I saw the usually imposing 4-star general, pale-faced and gripping the handrail, vomiting uncontrollably. But he never backed down, his eyes staring dead ahead to the south. "What if a Japanese destroyer shows up?" Huffman shouted over the wind. I checked the pressure gauge on the torpedo tube and smiled bitterly. Then we rush them. At this range, we fire all torpedoes, then strafe their bridge with machine guns. We are the decoys, Huffman. If it comes to it, we trade our lives to buy time for the 41 boat. Luckily, maybe God was working overtime that weekend too. We used the PT boat's shallow draft to skirt the Japanese patrol lines. Although we nearly exchanged fire with a friendly submarine due to a misunderstanding, we eventually delivered MacArthur safely to Mindanao after days of harrowing sailing. When the general boarded the B-17 bomber to Australia, he looked back at us, covered in oil, unshaven, eyes bloodshot, uniforms in tatters. "I shall return," he said, but we couldn't go back. The end of Squadron 3 was tragic. Lacking supplies, the remaining torpedo boats lost combat capability one by one. Some ran aground, some were bombed. By April, to prevent these former partners from falling into Japanese hands, we were forced to scuttle them ourselves. I watched PT-34 sink into the sea amidst the flames. It felt like putting down a wounded warhorse with my own hands. Our batch of sailors finally had to pick up rifles, move to the land, and continue fighting in the jungle alongside Filipino guerrillas. The defeat in the Philippines taught us a bloody lesson. Courage alone is not enough. In modern naval warfare, we need better radar, reliable torpedoes, and deadlier tactics. October 1942, Solomon Islands, Tulagi. If hell has an entrance, it must be that straight north of Guadalcanal. We later called it Iron Bottom Sound because there were enough sunken warships there to pave the ocean floor with steel. I returned to the front lines as a replacement for Squadron 2. This time, we upgraded to the newer PT boats, Elco's 80-foot class. They were longer, more stable, and packed more firepower, but they were still made of wood. The Tulagi base was a nightmare. The air was filled with the smell of rotting coconuts, mud, and the lingering stench of death. Mosquitoes were as big as bombers, and everyone had either malaria or dengue fever. But this was the pivot point that would decide the Pacific War. The Japanese possessed formidable night-fighting capabilities. By day, the skies over Guadalcanal belonged to the U.S. Marines' Cactus Air Force, but by night, the sea belonged to the Imperial Japanese Navy. They used formations of high-speed destroyers to rush into the strait under the cover of darkness, delivering troops and supplies to the island, and incidentally shelling our Henderson Field with large-caliber naval guns. This was the famous Tokyo Express. The enemy we faced had changed. No longer clumsy transport ships, but the world's elite destroyer squadrons. They had the terrifying, long lance torpedoes, highly trained night lookouts, and deadly 127mm main guns. And our mission was to go out at night and stop these steel monsters. Late night, October 13th, 1942, waters north of Guadalcanal. That night, the alarm was hair-raising. Intelligence indicated this wasn't a normal Tokyo Express. A massive fleet led by 2 battleships, Congo and Haruna, was charging in with murderous intent. Battleships. God, those were 30,000-ton monsters. One of their secondary guns was bigger than our entire boat. "Squadron 3, all units sortie." Squadron Commander Montgomery's voice trembled over the radio, a mix of excitement and fear. So we rushed into the darkness, 4 PT boats, like 4 angry fireflies, charging at a herd of rampaging elephants. The sea was pitch black. Suddenly, huge flashes lit up the distance. That was the light of battleship main guns firing. Seconds later, the dull thunder rolled in. Pillars of fire shot up from the direction of Henderson Field. Target sighted, range 4,000 yards. By the flash of the guns, we saw those massive silhouettes. Prepare to attack. PT-38 was in the lead. At a suicidal distance of only 400 yards from the battleships, the captain ordered torpedoes away. Under normal circumstances, this would be a guaranteed kill, but the damn tropical climate betrayed us again. Due to damp torpedo propellant, 2 torpedoes didn't fire at all, and one simply slid out of the tube and flopped into the sea with a splash, like a bad joke. Damn it, hard to port, retreat. Just then, the Japanese destroyers spotted us. Searchlight beams stabbed through the night like the judgment swords of God, trapping us instantly. The light was so intense we couldn't open our eyes, leaving us naked under the enemy's guns. Boom, boom. The destroyer's secondary guns and autocannons began to fire wildly. Water columns exploded around us, higher than our masts. We zigzagged like madmen, frantically deploying smoke canisters. PT-60, in its panic, ran headlong onto a coral reef near the shore, stranded and immobile. Although we didn't hit the battleships that night, and you could say we fled in disgrace, we learned later that our presence had an unexpected effect. The Japanese commander, Takeo Kurita, the guy who later became famous for losing his nerve at Leyte Gulf, was spooked by our shadows darting through the smoke. He thought he was being ambushed by American submarines and feared air attacks at dawn, so he hastily ordered a retreat without fully destroying the airfield. This was the PT boat's first secret function, asymmetrical deterrence. We didn't actually need to sink the battleships. As long as we existed, as long as our engines roared in the dark, the Japanese dared not slow down to unload cargo freely, dared not aim their guns leisurely. We were the shadows in the corner of their eyes, the ghosts giving them nervous breakdowns. December 11th, 1942, Cape Esperance. If the previous battles were harassment, then tonight we would rewrite history. It was the last attempt by the Japanese Tokyo Express commander Raizo Tanaka. The commander, known as Tenacious Tanaka, brought 11 destroyers to try and deliver a final batch of life-saving rations to Guadalcanal, and we, the 8 PT boats of Squadron 2, had laid a dragnet waiting for them. This time, we learned our lesson. We no longer acted alone, but adopted wolf-pack tactics. We split the PT boats into groups, hiding in the shadows of Savo Island and the dark background of the coastline. More importantly, we began to figure out how to use radar. Although early radar often malfunctioned, in the pitch-black night, it was our only eye. The battle didn't start well. PT-44, commanded by my friend Freeland, was unfortunately spotted by the Japanese. Concentrated fire from 4 Japanese destroyers instantly turned it into a fireball. I watched helplessly as it exploded, my heart wrenching. But PT-44's sacrifice was not in vain. It drew the Japanese attention. Tanaka made a fatal mistake. To unload those iron drums filled with food, he ordered the fleet to slow down, and to avoid detection by U.S. planes, he ordered engines stopped for silence, drifting into the bay. This was the moment PT-37 and PT-40 had been waiting for. At this time, my boat, PT-109, not Kennedy's boat, another of the same model, was lying in ambush on the flank. Through my binoculars, I saw that huge black shape, the Japanese flagship Teruzuki. It was the newest Akizuki-class anti-aircraft destroyer, boasting powerful 100mm high-velocity guns, their pride and joy. But stopped dead in the water, it was a sitting duck. Range 1,500 yards, fire tubes 1 and 2. This time, no duds, no malfunctions. We held our breath in the darkness, counting the seconds, Boom! A dull, terrifying sound rolled across the water. That wasn't the sound of a shell exploding. That was the scream of a torpedo tearing through a keel. A massive column of water rose from the port side of the Teruzuki, followed immediately by the sympathetic detonation of her magazines. The glare instantly lit up half of Iron Bottom Sound, turning night into day. Hit, we got him. The whole crew cheered. That 2,700-ton giant sank within minutes. Raizo Tanaka had to transfer to another destroyer and flee in disgrace. That night, we did more than sink a destroyer. More importantly, of the 1,200 supply drums the Japanese dropped because of our interference and attacks, the Japanese on shore only recovered 200. The Japanese on Guadalcanal weren't killed by bullets. They were starved to death by us. Cutting off that last mouthful of rice was the work of us plywood knights. The sinking of the Teruzuki became the straw that broke the camel's back for the Japanese psyche, forcing their final decision to evacuate Guadalcanal. Mid-1943, New Guinea, Tufi Base. With the end of the Guadalcanal campaign, the form of the war changed. The Japanese no longer foolishly sent large destroyers for the Tokyo Express because they were too big a target. They switched to a craftier tactic, ant transport. They requisitioned hundreds of small landing barges called daihatsu. These barges had an extremely shallow draft, hugging the coastline, moving supplies secretly at night like ants moving house. Our torpedoes ran into big trouble. Facing daihatsu barges that drew only a meter or so of water, our expensive torpedoes passed right under them like they were passing through air, missing completely. And they were small, blending into the background of the reefs, hard to spot. Our enemy changed, so we had to change too. We needed a new weapon, a weapon capable of brutal, close-quarters brawling. Strip those damn torpedo tubes off. Leave two. The captain looked at the technician. Sir, that's against regulations. Out here, staying alive is the regulation? Mount that 37mm cannon for me? It was a crazy field modification plan. We bolted any heavy weapon we could find onto the decks of the PT boats. A 37mm M4 autocannon scavenged from the nose of a crashed P-39-era Cobra fighter. Mount it. That was a shipwrecker. An Army 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft gun, mounted on the stern. One shot could turn a barge into splinters. We even got our hands on multi-barreled rocket launchers from somewhere. If you saw my boat in late 1943, you'd think it was a monster. It was no longer a pure torpedo boat. It had transformed into a heavy gunboat. We became tanks on the sea. In the dark nights of New Guinea, this was no longer elegant naval warfare. It was a brutal slaughter akin to street fighting. Our tactics shifted from ambush torpedo run to radar search close-in gunfight. I remember one night near Bougainville, our SO-3 radar picked up several moving blips in the near-shore clutter. Range 800 yards, prepare star shells. As the flares went up, the ghastly white light revealed 3 daihatsu barges packed with Japanese soldiers. Open fire, tear them apart. Instantly, our Bofors, 37mm cannon, and twin machine guns opened up simultaneously. It was like splashing out streams of a red metal storm. The 40mm high-explosive shells hit the wooden barges, blowing them into balls of fire and sawdust. The Japanese soldiers tried to return fire with rifles and 25mm guns, but against our fortress-like firepower, it was futile. We could even hear the screaming. The sea was covered in floating debris and bodies. The water dyed red, attracting sharks. It was cruel. Yes, it was a massacre. But I thought of Pearl Harbor. I thought of our brothers on the Bataan Death March. Every barge sunk meant one less box of ammo, one less bag of rice, one less soldier on the front lines. Like hunting dogs, we blockaded every bay, cut off every channel. In this war of attrition, the PT boat became the absolute king of the coastal blockade. August 1943, Blackett Strait. Before telling of the final showdown, I must mention the incident that caused a stir in the fleet, about that tall, skinny lieutenant named John Kennedy. By then, the PT boat force had expanded, and many new guys had arrived. Kennedy was one of them. He always had that Boston upper-crust accent, but in the grease-stained engine room, he was covered in sweat, just like us. It was an interception mission against the Japanese destroyer Amagiri. Honestly, that operation was a disaster of confused command. Although we had radar, coordinating dozens of PT boats amidst chaotic comms was impossible. PT-109 was on low-speed patrol at the time, running only one engine to hide the noise. Tactically, this was fine, but physically, it was a tragedy. When the Amagiri, a 2,000-ton steel destroyer, charged out of the darkness at 30 knots, Kennedy had no time to evade. A friend of mine on the nearby PT-169 said he saw that terrifying moment with his own eyes. The destroyer sliced into the boat like a sharp knife into a cream cake. PT-109 was cut in half at the waist, instantly erupting in flames. Everyone thought they were dead. No one survives a collision and explosion like that. But days later, a miracle happened. Kennedy led the survivors, drifting in waters full of sharks and Japanese patrols, and was finally rescued from a deserted island. This wasn't just a survival story. It became a symbol of our PT boat spirit. Even if cut in half, even in a desperate situation, as long as we have a breath, we don't give up. That spirit sustained us all the way to the final Surigao. October 24th, 1944, the Philippines, Surigao Strait. This was the moment we had waited 2 years, for MacArthur kept his promise. He returned. And so did we. Intelligence showed that to thwart the Lady Landing, the Japanese initiated the Show-1 operation, a Nishimura fleet, composed of 2 battleships, Fuso, Yamashiro, and heavy cruisers would try to force their way through the Surigao Strait at night, and this time, we were no longer those helpless, broken boats from the Philippines years ago. 7th Fleet Commander Admiral Oldendorf devised the most perfect ambush trap in naval history. At the north end of the strait, he deployed the battle line of battleships and cruisers to cross the T. And at the south entrance and the center, acting as the first line of defense, was us, the 39 PT boats of Task Group 70.1. Our mission: reconnaissance, harassment, division, attrition. We were the tripwire. We were the bell ringers of doom. That night, the strait was pitch black, and rain poured down. This was good for our radar, but a disaster for Japanese optical spotting. I was part of Division 12. We floated silently in the shadow of Panayan Island, letting the rain beat against our faces. The radar operator stared intently at the green screen as the blip grew larger. Contact, range 12 miles, large target, speed 20 knots. It was Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's fleet. In a single column, they were marching blindly into this death trap. All ahead full, torpedoes ready. 39 PT boats, like a swarm of ghosts dancing in the dark, pounced on the Japanese fleet from all directions. This was no longer a chaotic encounter. This was a calculated hunt. We used radar to lock onto targets, closing to point-blank range under the cover of the storm. The Japanese panicked completely. Their searchlights swept wildly across the sea, beams refracting eerily in the rain curtain. Large-caliber main guns fired blindly. Massive geysers exploded around us, shrapnel hammering against the hull like hail. Hard to port. Smoke. We filled the Japanese fleet's path with torpedoes. Although most missed due to their frantic evasion, we achieved our goal. We disrupted their formation, exposed their position, and like horseflies, we exhausted them, leaving them unable to focus on the main American force to the north. And we bit into flesh PT-137, that lucky little guy, originally intended to attack a destroyer, but the torpedo missed. However, that stray torpedo miraculously hit the flagship of the following Shima fleet, the light cruiser Abukuma. With a muffled thud, the Abukuma slowed down and eventually fell behind. This was the first heavy hammer blow we dealt the Japanese. When Nishimura's main force was sent to the bottom by the concentrated, radar-guided fire of our battleships at the north end of the strait, the battle intensified. At dawn, my division was ordered to search the strait for stragglers. We found a heavily damaged Japanese destroyer, the Asagumo. Her bow had been blown off, but she was still resisting. "That's the bastard that fired at us last night." The captain gritted his teeth. "Send her on her way." It was a strange cycle. 2 years ago, we could only run when we saw a destroyer. Now, this steel monster lay before us like a dying whale. PT-323 launched the attack first. We zigzagged through the waves, dodging her remaining guns. Torpedo away! 3 torpedoes entered the water. Seconds later, the Asagumo's stern was blown away. She began to sink rapidly. Watching those Japanese sailors jump into the sea, I felt no pity, only a sense of release. From Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, from Guadalcanal to here, we finally settled the score. The Battle of Surigao Strait was the last battleship duel in human history, but it was us who opened the curtain and swept the battlefield August 1945, the Philippines, Samar Beach. The war ended. That big mushroom cloud finished everything. We thought we would sail our boats back to San Francisco like heroes, to flowers and applause. But reality is cruel. The Navy Department issued the final order: disband in place, destroy equipment. This was the scene that broke my heart the most. These PT boats, covered in scars, companions through life and death, were deemed to have no retention value and not worth shipping back to the States because of their wooden hulls. We had to burn them with our own hands. That afternoon, the sun was blinding. We stripped the machine guns, radar, and those expensive Packard engines off the boats and piled them to the side. Then we dragged the empty hulls onto the beach and doused them with gasoline. I looked at my boat, the boat that dodged destroyer pursuit in Guadalcanal, hunted barges in New Guinea, and witnessed victory in Surigao. I watched that mahogany hull that had protected me countless times crackle in the flames. In that moment, the beach was filled with the sound of weeping. It was a weeping more painful than during combat. A bunch of tough guys watching their comrades turn to ash. Epilogue: The Immortal Ghost. Back to Portland, 1995. The engine sound of PT-658 gradually dies down. Volunteers are wiping down the hull. People often ask me, what was the secret of the PT boat? Why did the Navy stop building them? Sitting in my wheelchair, watching the blue smoke puff from that Packard engine, I can finally give an accurate answer to those so-called experts who study war history with a magnifying glass later on. It wasn't just because we were brave. That's the Hollywood version. The real secret lies in the fact that our plywood fleet happened to hit the Imperial Japanese Navy in its most fatal soft spot. We won on environment. The Pacific War wasn't a line-up-and-shoot affair on the open ocean. It was a maze game played in countless coral reefs, shallows, and narrow straits. Japanese battleships and cruisers were deep-sea sharks. They ran aground near the shore. But us? Our draft was less than 5 feet. We could squeeze into dead angles they couldn't enter, launching attacks from places they never expected. We turned the vast Pacific into countless dangerous dark alleys, and in a dark alley, the little guy with a dagger is often more dangerous than the giant with a spear. Secondly, it was our amazing adaptability. Look at the German E-boats or Italian MS boats. They remained torpedo boats until the end, but we were different. When we found torpedoes couldn't hit those damn flat-bottomed barges, we didn't stick to dogma. We immediately turned our boats into fire hedgehogs. We welded on rockets and mounted Bofors guns right on the front lines. This tactical flexibility turned us from pure, giant killers into perfect supply line cutters. The most important thing we did in New Guinea and the Philippines wasn't sinking a few destroyers, but completely choking the throats of the Japanese island garrisons. Tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers didn't die in combat. They died of starvation and disease because of our blockade. Furthermore, it was the asymmetry of technology and perception. In the early battles, we suffered, but once the SO-3 radar became widespread, the rules of the game changed. While the Japanese were still relying on lookouts with cat-like eyes staring into the dark, we had already locked onto them like we had a god's eye view. In night combat, whoever sees the other first wins. We turned the night from the Japanese's ally into their grave. Finally, and most importantly, was the psychological deterrence we created. This was a miniature version of the fleet-in-being theory. Like at Guadalcanal, we didn't even need to score actual hits. Just by shouting on the radio, just by carving a few white wakes on the sea, we could make a vice admiral like Takeo Kurita turn around and run. This constant harassment and pressure kept the Japanese Navy's nerves taut until they snapped. We exchanged cheap wood and gasoline for their expensive steel and morale. That is why we won. Not because of miracles, but because we were the most efficient war machines. Our existence shattered the hierarchy of naval warfare. It proved that in modern war, big does not necessarily mean strong. We utilized speed, darkness, radar, and courage to create a model of asymmetrical warfare. We were the guerrillas of the Pacific. We severed the Japanese arteries and blinded their eyes. History may only remember those battleships weighing tens of thousands of tons, but on the floor of that vast Pacific Ocean, beside every sunken Japanese destroyer, echoes the roar of a Packard engine. I am Jack Sullivan, former U.S. Navy PT boat sailor. This is my story, dedicated to those brothers who fought in plywood coffins. May the sea remember us forever.